It's a great pleasure to be here. My first time in this auditorium was in 1998, Hukupuro, and the presentation of the UNCTAD report, annual report on trade. And that was quite an occasion. Jan Kregel and others, very nice time. And I'm going to take you on a journey in this paper. It's a kind of attempt to take a step back and understand some of the problems that we are seeing in the world today, having to do with the intersection of popular movements and economic dynamics, the consequence of the extended period of financialization in which we're living right now. The paper was actually proposed to me by Eugenia Correa, who is one of the great economists of Mexico and passed away very suddenly in 2021. And Eugenia made me the challenge for a conference in Mexico, a virtual conference, to combine these two things, intersectional inequality and the dynamics of globalization, financial globalization. Now, I want to just celebrate her for a moment to begin and then to end. She was 15 years old in 1968 and was motivated, as many of her generation in Mexico, by, of course, the Olympics was there, and it was a period of great social unrest and social movements in Mexico. And you will remember, for example, scenes like this one from that period of time, and the great movement and demands for justice that students in the streets put out and were part of the idea that we could change the world. I was a little bit young for that generation, but I caught the wave. And I have to say that my generation, it was a disappointment what we did not as a generation succeed. But my hope is that we can continue to try to move forward. There's Eugenia with many, many books, wonderful person and wonderful mentor to people in Mexico. So in her honor, this paper, which is an effort to pull some things together. Now, okay, so we're going to have 9 parts. So it's, as I say, it's a journey, and I'll try not to take all afternoon with you on the journey. But basically, we're to start with the idea of feedback loops. And the idea that basically we had, as we start the neoliberal era, we have a situation where there's severe financial crises in the periphery, the global periphery, and they force sovereign governments, such as this one, to cut services and discipline their macro policies so as to repay debt. In Brazil's case, the debt's not repaid until the early 2000s. So basically, what we had was a situation where from the very beginning of the neoliberal period, maintaining access to circuits of globalized finance and wealth undercut communal well-being for masses of people. This is a squeeze on social reproduction that in turn leads many, many people in the world, an increasing number, to have to migrate in order to survive and look for opportunity. This then takes us, as I say, it's a journey. The journey goes then to the destination nations, where they go. And there we have a migration wave that destabilizes labor markets and public goods provision, right? And worsens conflicts over resources. And these play out across historical intersections of divides of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, and so on. And so we have now global north nations overloaded with bailout-related debt. Think of the United Kingdom, whose national sovereign debt doubled in one day, actually more than doubled in one day in November 2008, the bank bailout. And then what do you have? Of course, more than 12 years of austerity. And these nations, their inability to restore former levels of well-being crushes living standards, spills over into the political realm, and leads feeds this politics of anger and this idea of blaming the other. In the case of the UK, it gives us Brexit. In the case of the US, it gives us Donald Trump, etc. So blaming the other becomes the central in political discourse. Governments that can no longer satisfy their people's demands for material well-being, they instead pursue policies that validate intersectional rage and revenge. So, in the case of the UK, you have the Tory government now highlighting the idea of turn back the boats and let's fly refugees to Rwanda. Rwanda. It's a serious policy. It's in contemporary debate right now in the UK. So those on the subordinate rungs of our stratified society are hit hardest by welfare cuts and unemployment. Those who are positioned with intra-societal power, they don't admit the stratification arises. They don't need to, they dismiss it as identity politics, right? And so the reward for the faithful followers of these powerful people is not material reward, a restoration of living standards, but basically just vengeance. If you have not watched one of the political rallies led by Donald Trump, please check it out. You'll see it is all about vengeance. So these subordinate groups are defined as the undeserving poor. They deserve no protection from the market, and violence against migrants and minorities replaces what was once class solidarity. Now, what about the role of economists in this? We're going to have sort of two subsections here on what economists have done. And when I say economists here, I mean mainstream economists. People pre-committed, I would say a mainstream, in my definition, is a person who begins with the idea of Walrasian and general equilibrium as the reference point for theorizing. It's the sort of the decentralized market equilibrium is our sine qua non, and trying to achieve equilibrium there is what we try to hope for. Now, and the idea is, right, let the markets work, and let's purify society by throwing out the unworthy, making them work. And just to say that there's examples of people who are talking about crises that we see, but only very partially. One that's notable is Angus Deaton, who writes in a book called Deaths of Despair, gets the Nobel Prize, has his own autobiography right now, a very strange autobiography. I think, David, I don't know if you've read it, but it's an odd piece of work in which basically he focuses on the tragedy of the average white man. Well, that is a tragedy, but there are other tragedies. And then we have, for example, the new consensus, well, actually, let's go to Charles Calomiris and Stephen Haber, who wrote a book in 2015 called Fragile by Design that reinterprets the roots of the subprime crisis and basically lays the blame at a government that oversteps the bounds and, according to these authors, forced banks to make loans to people they knew were too risky. In other words, rather than thinking about racial redlining and exploitation of people of color, they flipped the script and they managed to blame the victim for the problem. And the third example would be Kurdia and Woodford. I've got an essay coming out in the Journal of Economic Issues that sort of does a number on Michael Woodford in the way that the reinterpretation or the interpretation of how to do macroeconomics these days for mainstreamers runs through DSGE, but it also runs through almost a thought control regime in which basically we define things as simply as we can. Those of you who've done DSGE models know they're very hard to solve. And so basically, let's keep it simple. So we Woodford reduces the subprime crisis to financial frictions and basically information anomalies. And there's nothing more to be said. The models need no more description than that. The entire history that's behind that is read out. Now, invisibilizing then these feedback loops is a big part of what these models do. You don't get to talk about these things. You can talk about them if you want to be a sociologist or in politics, but not if you're an economist. And so essentially, what we have is this system of stratification where we identify the groups that don't matter. Those who are asked to provide low-wage work, who insecure labor, let's sustain the growth machine, and they themselves are disciplined by a floating pool of migrant laborers with no political rights. So this political disenfranchisement, this invisibilization of those who are victimized by declining state services makes financial crises less costly for elites. Loosen controls on finance makes them more likely. This is then a self-deviation amplifying feedback loop that goes on, and it's just simply ignored. The causes and effects are all intertwined, but just denied in models. And so if you were to study, go to like the Journal of Monetary Economics, the JMCB, the AER, and then look up subprime crisis. In fact, look in the project on reconstructing macro that I think, David, you had a small role in that. I did too. I had something to do in the UK. And almost none of the papers actually talk about what really happened. And it's something like, well, it must be choice. You choose to default on your subprime contract. You must have chosen to take that contract, and basically the exploitation and the racism is written out of the story. Now, where did this come from? Well, actually, there was practice. The practice was in those first financial crises in the 1980s as the neoliberal era began. You know, what we had was a situation where you had the Latin American crisis, 82, and then the East Asian crisis in 97, in between the so-called tequila crisis. And basically there was a series of models, mostly game theoretic, principal agent models, that attributed these kind of problems to the idea that there must be moral hazard problems, that these borrower nations who were in trouble were bad actors. There was sufficiently too low punishments to motivate people to pay back. Actually, if you look at that, it's ridiculous. Why is it that Brazil finally pays off its sovereign debt in the early 2000s? It wasn't about that, right? It was something else going on, but something that can't be named. Now, those models of crisis turn into the second generation, and even now third generation models of currency crisis, where basically, you know, they kind of focus more on just sunspots, on beliefs, small changes in investor beliefs that can lead to sudden stops, but nothing to really be explained. There's equilibrium here, equilibrium there. Which one you choose is almost, you're at is almost random. And so, you know, you'll see in shifting to that, there's this kind of acceptance that we're in a world of open financial flows. Now, this then leads right into, in this world of deregulated finance, to the idea of global financial cycles, the idea that basically we're in a world where nothing can stop the flow of capital. It might be subject to sunspots. Doesn't really matter what borrowers do. The money is going to flow. It's going to flow where it will. And it's going to be, if we believe Helene Ray, it's going to be more efficient than if we stop it from flowing. And so we're stuck there in a world where we go from the impossible trinity, you know, the famous idea that nations can only control two of the three things. Capital flows can be controlled or not. You can have independent monetary policy, or you can fix your exchange rate. You can only do two of those things. Helene Ray and Boreal basically say, no, that's dead. There's only a dilemma. You actually cannot control anything, just how open the financial flows are, but beyond that, nothing much. Now, that's not seen as a problem. Here's Ray, basically a quote from one of her papers, 2015. The neoclassical growth model is behind many of our economic intuitions. See, I'm just saying, she's writing something about financial globalization. Why does she have the need to bow down and kiss the feet of the neoclassical growth model? Really? Is behind many of our economic intuitions regarding, this is thought control, right? This is thought control. This is Michael Woodford with his 19,000 references to his textbook, now revised. Now he's got a new one if you want to follow the flow. Behind many of our economic intuitions regarding why the free flow of capital could be beneficial. Within this model, financial integration brings improvements in allocative efficiency and better risk sharing. Okay, so what triggers it? Okay, well, actually, then we go, let's follow this literature. Global shortages of safe assets. What does this do? If you want to see somebody who's really betrayed sort of the reality, look at the work of Caballero and Krishnamurti, the idea of shortages of safe assets. Basically, that there's a global demand for safe assets because we all want them. Who's got the comparative advantage in generating safe assets? The United States, U.S. Treasuries. Why? Well, because what's the one lender of last resort in the world at today? It's the U.S. Federal Reserve. Why? With the dollar. Something about the dollar. So don't we all want to go and acquire the safe assets so the capital flows, we go and we seek that the capital flows into the U.S., and that empowers U.S. people to live beyond their means and be the global consumer of last resort. Nice, huh? The fundamental imbalance that lies at the very root of the entire neoliberal era. That's what it's all about. What else triggers financial flows? Underdeveloped financial markets, especially Asia, and excessively expansionary monetary policy. Now, I mentioned just this because basically Borio is trying to hang on to some kind of Keynesianism, but basically he imagines that we're seeing some kind of excessive risk-taking, wants to be more Keynesian, but when you really look at it, there's structural patterns here that cannot be denied. Here's just one picture, using one of the IMF calculations of Valencia and Levant of where there's been financial crises. They just do some counts. And if you look at this, you'll notice that, look at where the financial crises are. There's 99 in Latin America and the Caribbean from the 70s to the present. Western Europe has that one decade, right, where there's some problems. And then Eastern Europe, 1 decade where there's problems, the collapse of the subprime bloc. There's the collapse of the subprime crisis there. In East Asia, there's just the East Asian crisis. Other than that, it's all about Latin America. So let's take a big step back and go to our next part just to say, well, these ahistorical interpretations really don't stand up. This idea of there's moral hazard by borrower nations. So we can just use some little micro models. Or how about the subprime crisis, the notion of minorities as rent-seeking coalitions are convenient facades, right, for elites who don't really want to be bothered, don't want to have their power challenged. Now, what we have instead is, developing countries in a situation where the profile of each is a reflection of histories of exploitation, colonization, imperialism, and so on. And, these powers have built their edifices of exploitation and plunder. Here's the list, right? African labor on American plantations, South Asian labor producing goods for the English dining table, right? European and Southern Black labor fueling America's Industrial Revolution, et cetera, people being replanted for gain. Now, the thing is, of course, when you no longer need that stoop labor, or you no longer need those factories in the inner city, then those become your surplus populations who are actually just surplus to requirements because you've got other people willing to come in and take jobs for less. Surplus people with deficits in skills and education. These are easy analytical targets. And, in some sense, you see like Janet Yellen right now talking about the need for the new supply side economics to have education and such on for these folks. So that's a piece of the puzzle, but you got to see the thing whole. Now, I want to draw your attention, again, because of my emphasis on money and finance, to the problem of basically the behind this, one of the architectures is the global architecture of power and finance. And basically, in order to kind of flip around that Caballero Ray framework, we need to make two changes. Of course, we want to substitute a post-Keynesian for a new classical macro framework. And we could go further than post-Keynesian, but that's enough maybe. And then we can talk about power. With power, then we bring in Marx and we bring in Kalecki and we bring in some of our other the heroes of our framework. So, we have to think about things like Keynesian real time and so on, and power asymmetries, the realities of space. And there's, some references here. There's Sheila Dow's work, and Richard Peet has done some really nice work within economic geography. But let me just say that, the concentration of power in a few places, as Pete puts it nicely, that controls a world of distant others. Nicely put. Now, but let's go through and just take a brief tour through where the particular structure of power comes from. And for that, we can look at some of the work of Jean D'Arista. And just to remember that in the 1980s, post the Bretton Woods system, you have the U.S. power emerging, even as the United States has lost its global hegemony. But the fact that the U.S. Federal Reserve could bail out the money center banks that were in trouble from a variety of crises, both the Latin American crisis and the crisis of oil overexploration in the U.S. South, this basically makes the U.S. a safe haven. There's a promise that we will bail out these too big to fail banks. And if you're in the U.S. money markets, you will be protected. They stop a run on the money markets. And basically from that moment forward, they protect both those markets and the institutions who are the main players in those markets, what I call mega banks, but there's other names. And basically this confers this positional power on the U.S. in the ability to define the rules of the game. There's a deregulation in the U.S. followed by deregulation elsewhere, and this permits the increasing penetration of the U.S. system into the rest of the world, and leads to a kind of global pyramid, as D'Arista calls it. You have a country at the top that can stop crises when they come to its borders, and those holding its liabilities, the U.S. liabilities, are able to do something about that, but nobody else really can move. And so there's these pressures that are going to destabilize governments elsewhere and increase the returns to financial predation, but that are just part of the normal workings of the system. Basically money flows, and the developing nations are caught in this, and there's basically been then global changes. The entire global economy is affected by this global flux. As we mentioned, the U.S. turns to have a systematic current account deficit through the entire neoliberal period, the last 40 years. And accompanying that is a capital account inflow. And then after the Great Crisis, we have a situation where there's an embrace of austerity policy in the global North nations, not China, but Europe mostly. And the U.S. response was tepid, not firm. And consequently, the Obama economy was not as good as it was claimed, hence the possibilities for the revenge of Trump and so on when he runs against Hillary Clinton. Well, here you go. The current account positions by global areas reverses in the 2010s as a consequence of these global shifts. This is something, okay, so you have advanced economies which prior to the global crisis, as you can see, are in systematic deficit. This is all this is all the countries. The numbers don't quite add up to zero, but basically close enough. And then of course, against that, we have the emerging market and developing economies in dark black, in the black line, and you can see that they were in surplus. So basically, prior to the global crisis, if you're in the global south, you can export your way to growth. Famous. But actually, look what happens. It flips, it reverses. Now, the reversal gets strange once we hit the subprime, or once we get the COVID period. But basically, what we see is a situation where there's a structural global consequence of these macro financial policies. Everything affects everything else in ways that are actual structural, not just behavioral. And here's a different way of seeing it, a little bit more stark. And this now, instead of showing the current account surpluses, this is going to show you the net investment position, international investment position, and it's just the mirror of the other, right? It flips. And so that's not surprising at all. Now, there's only one room for one king in this kingdom. And basically the US, as an international lender of last resort, sits atop this currency hierarchy and offers a safe haven in a world of instability. And so this idea of the US consumers as global consumers of last resort, living beyond their means with excessive rates of polluting practices and so on, This is something that continues well after the United States loses its industrial dominance. And so essentially, the more prominent are these dollar-based markets, the wholesale money markets, the dollar-based commodity trade, dollar-based hedging practices, the more insurmountable is that dollar status. That's the shortage of safe assets. You need treasuries to backstop that whole system. And so essentially we have, a situation where there's a dependency on borrowing in dollars, the currency hierarchy is reinforced, and the only way around that is to basically try to build a current account surplus. That takes us then to the next part of our journey, which is, so we've got one hub, financial power in the neoliberal world. We're now going to go to the other hub, manufacturing power. And this is a story that unfolds in two parts. Phase one, Japan. And if we look at the post-World War, and actually even before World War II, you'll note that manufacturing and financial power were bundled together in many of these historical epochs. The UK dollar-based or pound-based standard, the imperial standard, was supported by the UK's leadership in the Industrial Revolution, something that's been well described by distinguished historians. The US, of course, immediately after World War II, dominates global manufacturing. 52% of all manufacturing is in the United States at the end of World War II into the 1950s. And of course, then the US names the game by setting up its own gold-based dollar standard. And however, there was already decline setting in through the 1960s. And essentially what happens is that Asia fills the gaps. And this gap in terms of manufacturing comes in two stages. First is Japan. Now, Japan's in a very privileged position. There's a wonderful book wonderful books actually, by an historian called John Dower. One of them is called War Without Mercy, in which he describes the Pacific War between the US and Japan, and the racial hatred and bigotry that characterized both sides of that conflict. But then the book ends by noting that after World War II ends, almost immediately, the image of Japan and of the Japanese in the American imaginary is changed because Japan becomes the front line in the Cold War, in which, of course, the US and its allies, the West, are facing off against the East, and Russia and its allies, or the USSR at that time. And so actually, Japan's state-led capitalism is in a good position. What were the Zaibatsu become the Keiretsu, and they, with a sort of very sophisticated, integrated Japanese production system, a system that's capitalist, but involves a lot of planning and cooperation, comes to the fore. And basically, Japan quickly shifts from low-cost production to a sophisticated production, lots of foreign direct investment throughout Asia, and essentially there's a spread of industrial knowledge by networking and so on, and the creation of what will be called the flying geese paradigm, where essentially what we have with Japan is, well, actually, let's take a look first at something else. This is just a little picture I took from a firm called Statistica. And what I've got there is the green line at the top is the average rate of US growth in the 1960s and 70s. And basically anything above that line means it's growing faster. And the point of this is just to show that in the 60s and 70s, that Bretton Woods period, you can see that lots of European nations are doing better than the United States. Europe was really catching up, implementing newer production technologies, replacing them and so on, while lots of the American conglomerates were rent-seeking and basically just exploiting their monopolistic pricing advantages. And so France and Germany and so on kind of race ahead. So the US then is hit by contradictions that force it to step away from the dollar-based gold standard by 1973. And just to say that, if you then look at the next period, the period of 1971 to 78 that I show there, what you see is that the United States there is actually that everybody's kind of caught up to the US, that everybody is hit by the supply side shocks in the 1970s. Now, how do you see Asia in this? Now in the US imaginary, it turns from our subhuman enemies in World War II to our innocent Asian friends that we're protecting from the Soviet Union, to feared competitors, people who are maybe participating in unfair competition with us in the U.S. scheme. This is not the way that, for example, one of the Japanese theorists of foreign direct investment, Kojima, he describes it, the pattern of Japanese competition as, quote, a harmonious mechanism of collective advancement by means of consecutive catching up efforts. Now there he's describing the way in which Japan, as it goes into industrial strength, increasingly sophisticated industrial production, lots of electronics, and eventually cars and automobiles, motorcycles, electronics, and so on, Japan actually begins to take its production facilities and spread them into the rest of East Asia in the flying geese paradigm model. And this is cooperation inside Asia. There's something that builds Asia and sort of begins to make a complex of production and consumption inside that part of the world that preserves Japan's role at the center of a knowledge production process. I was recently in Kyoto, and I happened to pass by the Panasonic Research and Development facility. 1 square block by 2 square blocks, 10 stories tall. Panasonic is not giving away its research edge. They are fighting to stay there. It's a different model than the US has and that people study. So there's, prosperity comes to Asia, goose by goose. There's more and more countries introduced into the Asian export production consumption complex. There's, accusation of Japan. Now that's where we come to the end of the first phase of Asia's entry into the production pole of global strength. Because basically in the Plaza Hotel, New York City, at that time, Japan, still under the kind of wing of the United States and still without its political autonomy, yet fully developed, basically is told by other members of the G5 to back off, quit investing in the United States. The yen has to rise. The yen was too low. It's giving you an unfair advantage. Back off and quit doing what you're doing. Now, actually, what happens then is that there is a refocusing on investment inside Japan by Japanese banks and others. There is, in fact, a higher yen, and the consequence is that there's an explosion of asset prices and real estate prices inside Japan that then leads to a bubble that bursts, which throws Japan into at least a decade or more, arguably more, of stagnation. So this, sort of leads to a situation where this kind of notion of Japan as the ultimate competitor, that ends up being short-lived. Now, if you look at any of the statistics, you will see that Japan is an interesting paradox in today's global economy. But we're going to leave Japan right there for the minute. And here's just a picture of the flying goose model. There's the idea that, the newly industrializing countries and ASEAN, and there's China pulling along with Japan in the lead was the image. Well, because that brings us to part 2 of the Asian presence. Of course, the entry into what some call the Chinese century. And, this is attracting initially then, again, there's 2 phases. Japan by 1989 is when its bubble bursts, 89, 90. And Japan is already entering a decade of what they regard as depression. Doesn't look like depression to us, but if you're in Japan, your standard's higher. And but we have then East Asia continuing to grow, and lots of Western banks, Japanese banks, US banks, lending into East Asia, Korea and Thailand and other places, as there's urbanization and industrialization going on. This comes to a sudden stop in 1997, as mentioned earlier, as basically it's just one of these things. There was speculation, there was misuse. We're kind of at the end of the dictatorship period in Korea. And basically what happens there is a mess, a global crisis, financial crisis, bigger than the Latin American crisis in its scope and scale, but one which is actually silently stopped within a couple of years by the entry of a new player on the stage, China. China actually sustains the demand for East Asian goods by stepping in with the first of what will prove to be a series of globally needed boosts to aggregate demand to keep the Asian bloc from collapsing. And of course, then China enters the WTO. Relying, but this time, note, China does not rely on Western banks or overseas lending to fuel its growth, its urbanization. Right? Remember that China is a multiple of the size of some of these other nations. But we're not talking about Japanese and American lending. We're talking about China with its very complex, but nationally, its internal system of banking with the big five Chinese banks that are state-owned leading the way. And basically, China then picks up the flying goose system and kind of repurposes it with its own firms in there. It doesn't completely displace Japan. There's kind of friendly competition and even not so friendly sometimes. But basically, China moves Japan over just as Korea makes space for itself as well. And there's kind of shared leadership as these countries, and then Taiwan is in there too, despite the best intentions of Xi Jinping. And basically, that complex becomes, along with Germany, the greatest exporting complex in the world. So it's Asia becomes an even more integrated production consumption hub, dominates global manufacturing, and now China is extending its reach by the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this is actually, and this was a kind of debate with Elias Jabbour, what was being followed here. Some say China was following the capitalist road. Elias and some of his co-thinkers would say no, that actually what's happening is that there's a state planning system that in some sense China is developing the forces of production are being advanced in China, and there's a new planned economy underway. Well, one thing is for sure, there's not going to be a new Plaza Accord. China's not going to sign anything at a table that says, oh, China, back off. That's not where we are. Because actually, this is just a graph that shows you that global production in Asia, East Asia is the dark black line there. This is a picture that takes us from 1990 to 2017. And what we see here is basically East Asia accounting for now almost 40% of global manufacturing value added. Much of that China, but not all of it. And instead, you see there's the United States, which is the dotted line that kind of curves downward and ends up beneath that China line in a declining position, and others as well. You can see that the other nations are kind of afterthoughts in that. The concentration of manufacturing value added is dramatic in these two places. And just a couple of other pictures to show you about the dominance of the Asian bloc in trade. This is a picture of trade between 2015 and 2019. Dark green, or green means growth in these years. The thicker the line, the faster the growth. And you can see that, and then the more the trade, I should say, well, let me say it differently. The thicker the line, the larger the trade. And you can see that in this period here, China linked into the EU, linked in to the US and so on, but notice those strong links inside Asia. Now compare that with the picture that comes next, because we're going to move to the next few years. We're going to go to basically 2019 to 2023. And of course, what you're going to see here, the orange line means that decline of trade between US and China. and actually decline in many places, the decline of trade itself, as there's a sort of slowdown of global trade, in part, of course, fueled by the thing. So it becomes easy now to blame China for these problems, just as the US once blamed Japan. And actually at the front of this blame game has been a person called Peter Navarro, who was both a professor at UC Irvine, but then became Trump's trade, representative, and was behind, or one of the figures encouraging the trade war that Donald Trump started in 2018, and that is not so clearly over. We don't have the rhetoric that Donald Trump loved to give us and will love to give us again if reelected. But if we ask questions like, for example, has the United States replaced the US representative on the WTO negotiation board, on the dispute resolution board? Answer is no. There was not an appointment under Trump. There is still not an appointment under the US. So just saying, it's not exactly still a trade war, but it's not exactly not. And so, that notion of blaming, and of course, here's just something that comes from a German foundation, but the Bertelsmann, which is linked to a German industrial complex. But this is the Western view of the Belt and Road Initiative as China builds its way across the continental space of Europe. Interesting, and lots more to be said about that as we go forward. But what this ends up with, and now as we turn to the last part of the talk, is it puts us in a world where there's these double hubs of global power. There's a triad kind of. You have, on the one hand, there's a financial core, the US itself, the safe haven of the dollar. Too big to fail mega banks at the core, surrounded by a shadow banking system that feeds off of them and is fed by them, and that earns fees, speculates, takes zero-sum bets, and tries to maintain enough capital and all that. Then you have the manufacturing core. It's East Asia, broadly considered, China at the core of that, but Japan, Korea, and Taiwan should not be discounted in that. These are, of course, interdependent cores. U.S. depends on East Asia's exports, and East Asia relies on U.S. consumer and investment markets. I believe it or not, I cut many slides from what I could show you, but there's one that's rather remarkable. If you look at China and its basically its manufacturing trade, you'll see something like a giant bubble. And then if you look at the deficit that China has on commodity imports, it's like a mirror. China has to sell abroad to support the commodities it needs to keep the machine going. So yes, it is becoming greener, but that is a powerful engine of interdependency. And then the third factor is the extensive, peripheral margin. Member nations who are at risk because they're in neither core. And you've got fragilities of provisioning and fragilities of finance, because you're subordinate, you're subject to subordinate financialization, and you're outside the currency hierarchy. It's just another picture to show you that this is a recent picture of the size of manufacturing output. And one thing to note here actually is the isolation of Latin America in these kinds of pictures. And also, for that matter, whenever you look at trade figures, look at the relative isolation of the United States itself from the rest of the world. So, yes, it's true that there's a lot of manufacturing in the US, but I think I got another picture coming. Maybe not. If it comes, we'll see it. In any case, we have these problems of core and periphery that are kind of reinvented and recharged by this new triad, this global triad structure that we have. There's human dynamics, a growing population of people that are immigrants traveling the world to try to make their living and send remittances home. It's become a powerful factor in the global economy. And there's also then financial dynamics linked to these national financial fragilities. Basically, nations at or near the core of production or of finance are immune from speculative attacks But every other part of the global system, that periphery is fair game. And if you are a country that's an emerging market economy, not on a concessionary financing basis, you're in play. And so that's a situation where basically you've got systematic financial fragilities. You're subject to carry trade or sudden stop or all kinds of games, currency devaluations. And you can do some things. You can try to set up capital controls. You can impose requirements on foreign capital, or what I'm going to emphasize here, you can buy excess stocks of currency reserves. This gives you some defensive power that you can use to try to make your way in the world as we have it. Now, here's just a picture that shows you India, Brazil, Mexico, different pictures of basically in either dollar terms or percentage of GDP terms. The point is that all these three countries are subject to current account deficits, whichever way we measure. And as a concept, so if you think of it, current account deficit means that you should be spending down reserves you have. You should be losing national wealth and assets, not vice versa. But check it out. Here's your net international investment position for India. Notice that everything's declining, but reserves rising. What's a reserve, right? It's a US dollar, shortage of safe assets. It's a safe asset. I got my safe assets, stay away. How about Mexico? Same picture. I did this with this work with Nicole Chirpa-Vielma, who's now at UC Santa Barbara. And so she graduated, and we found that this pattern is there for every nation in Latin America, including Brazil. Now these figures are a little bit old. I didn't think to update them, but sorry for that. But basically, what we have then is you got to focus on creating financial barriers, not infrastructure. You've got a subordinate position. You've got primary exports that you're sending to the imperial center. You've got underdeveloped industrialization. You're dependent on other nations' industrial exports, but what can you do about it? You're kind of trapped, right, in uneven development. I'll kind of just reference there to Prebisch and Furtado, just to say that that's long-standing. And basically, this leads to this situation of, along financial and industrial dimensions, reinforcing these patterns. These feedback loops continue and they deepen. Here, for example, is just defensive reserve accumulation across Latin America, despite the deficits as mentioned. And of course, the consequence of this, as we saw in that other graph, is that the Latin American net international investment position, Latin America as a whole, deteriorates. Other people own your assets. They own your banks, they own your industrial companies, et cetera. And it's all part of a pattern, right? And so we have these two arms of the trap. There's, on the one hand, the current account deficit in Latin America has deteriorated, commodity dependence. On the other hand, we have weakly traded currencies that force us to build up stocks of reserves. So, and the global banks with their shadow banking empires are playing a guard dog role, right? So you have to overborrow to protect yourself because you're overborrowing, right? Because you got to overborrow in order to sustain those reserves. You're not making money on net exports, so you got to borrow your way to get those reserves. So you're getting deeper in debt in order to avoid the consequences of debt. That's a contradiction straight out. And so why is it necessary? Well, again, let's just briefly remember Borio and Ray. You can only choose between controlling your exchange rate or your monetary policy, but we're in a destructive phase of what they call a global financial cycle. But I would just note here that Borio wants to flag that it must be something about excessive expansionary monetary policy. But if we look at Latin America in particular in this situation, you do not see imprudent central banks. To the contrary, the central banks have been pretty disciplined. You do not see failing financial systems. It's something else going on. It's the very structure of global power that's at work here and basically leading to shortages of opportunities. So essentially, let's skip this page just to say that people have to seek liquid assets, and basically the mega banks are increasingly empowered. Let's skip that because there's a couple of interesting pictures leading to just several more observations. One is that in the developing economies, we've got financialization increasing, buying time, as Wolfgang Streeck would put it, but the ability to provision for your populations is threatened, in decline, spiked by problems, wars and conflicts. You've got scapegoating, you've got movements that deny reality, and so there's flows of refugees and economic migrants. And this is just a picture I just picked up this morning from the UN. Remittances are far greater now than foreign direct investment on a global scale. Development assistance is that bottom line there. They slightly missed their labeling. But you can see that basically we're in a world where basically remittances are keeping this world going. And in advanced economies, as noted, to return to the other side of that dialectic, you've got citizens who are not making that much money. Their lives are not that good. Basically the governments cannot reassure these embittered citizens. They can't, can they keep the guest workers out? What about their supply of disposable low-cost labor? It leads to this contradiction between anti-foreigner bias and, stop the border, stop the people at the border, paranoid ideas that are bringing ghosts out of the closet, Nazi movements and white supremacy movements and so on. And basically putting back the theme of episodes of racialized violence into the national registry of many, many advanced countries. So this is, a situation that is blocking any kind of global response to climate change or enhanced human provision. I got to say, from 2015 to 2019, I was part of panels that they call the IGE at UNCTAD, Intergovernmental Experts something. And we would meet and discuss how to provision, how to finance the global warming and how to finance the SDGs. Those meetings stopped. They stopped in terms of discussing that. Now it's discussion about COVID. Now it's a discussion about Ukraine. Now it's about other things. The things that are threatening the global order and the world itself are kind of off the table now. And instead we have on the left, where people are going, and on the right, where they're coming from. I mean, this is a picture, you kind of know this picture, but there you go. Lots of these nations on the right are dependent upon those remittances in order to maintain balances. And the world itself, here's another new picture, newly published paper, where the authors just try to draw these circles connecting everything. And you can see that everybody's in play, everybody's involved. And of course, the outflow of remittances from some of the places like the Eurozone, Gulf states, US, to feed people elsewhere. An interdependent system of people on the move, people doing what they can because their governments no longer can. But all the provisioning recommendations that we have for global climate change and for SDGs depend on nation states backstopping the system. I think Bianca and I'm going to talk about a little bit of that next Wednesday, but it leads to a kind of difficult moment. We have this post-crisis literature on global financial flows. Deregulated flows of global finance cannot be stopped, and it limits the autonomy of national macro policy. Good, right? Good. Those bad governments, they did bad things, so let's stop them. But actually, we don't think about the structural features of this globalized macro financial system in our mainstream explanations. Why not? Well, because we're working with models, equilibrium models that are based on basically equilibrium fantasies. We don't pay attention to unequal power or stratification. The Latin America is lost in this. Its subordination which is, triple, right? Currency instability, lost manufacturing capacity, dependence on foreign capital and currency, as a consequence of this asymmetric structure of global power. And it's in a world system that itself is polarized between trade and finance. Now, the thing is that this is an extremely unstable system. Okay, you have Basel II, Basel III, can be Basel IV, I don't care. The support pillars sustaining this system that recreates and creates and recreates financial fragility, imposes stagnation, imposes losses, saves the system, rebuilds it, and makes it happen again. These pillars, which are basically the global mega banking system and the central banks of the key currencies, especially the US Fed, these pillars of this dual center system are crumbling. They are in place, but the political foundations of the global order are giving way, and we're in a world where there's no secure place to hide. We're going to need global cooperation and a global rethink very, very soon. We have always seen, those of us who are watching Brazil attempt to reclaim a path that was a very important path going forward, and actually thinking back to Recupero, being there in the moment, leading UNCTAD, 1998, or to Lula and his ministers trying to play a global mediating role. We're going to need that presence because this cannot survive for very much longer. The political foundations of this global order are cracking and giving way. That's where I'm going to stop it. Thank you for your attention.